hammer fell in silence. Tariffs, the oldest weapon in the Western playbook, struck again. This time, Washington turned its gaze on Africa, demanding that nations bend or break under the weight of new restrictions. For generations, such threats had worked. Leaders wavered, economies buckled, dignity was mortgaged. But then came a rupture. From a landlocked nation of barely 22 million, a voice rang out with no tremor. Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso said no, and the script collapsed. It was not only a rejection of tariffs, it was a declaration that Africa's survival would not be chained to American permission. The irony was brutal. A continent long dismissed as weak answered with unity, and a leader often underestimated turned humiliation back on a former U.S. president. In that refusal, Africa glimpsed something larger than trade. Sovereignty no longer negotiable, dignity no longer for sale. Stay with us and subscribe. This is more than a headline, it is a hinge in history. What you are about to hear may change how we see Africa's place in the world. The news broke not with the sound of gunfire, but with numbers typed on paper. Tariffs. Donald Trump announced sweeping restrictions on African exports. Gold, cocoa, textiles, cotton, and the very food staples that nourish millions. These were not symbolic gestures. They were calculated blows designed to tighten the throat of fragile economies and remind Africa of its place. In Washington's calculus, fear would do the rest. African leaders would scramble, plead for exemptions, and return to the table on their knees. But this time, the script did not hold. In Ouagadougou, a young soldier turned president refused to bend. Ibrahim Traoré did not bargain, did not ask for concessions. He blocked the tariffs outright. With one statement, he shattered decades of assumptions. That Africa must always absorb pain in silence, that sovereignty could be traded for access, that compliance was inevitable. The defiance was not quiet. His words carried through the streets of Burkina Faso like thunder rolling across dry savanna. People cheered not because a tax was refused, but because humiliation was finally answered. For the first time in living memory, a West African leader told Washington that dignity would not be mortgaged. Tariff blackmail, Traoré called it, and he rejected it as if brushing dust from his uniform. To understand the weight of that moment, one must recall the history. For decades, tariffs were the hidden chains of global commerce. They were the colonial contract rewritten in legal jargon, the invisible whip that forced weaker economies into line. Aid and sanctions were the carrot and stick. Tariffs were the chokehold. They had worked against Mexico, against China, against Europe itself. When Donald Trump applied them, governments moved, industries faltered, concessions followed. Yet in 2025, the weapon found no purchase in Burkina Faso. The so-called small player broke the pattern. By refusing to comply, Traoré announced that the game itself had changed. Africa was no longer a continent of isolated pawns, but of nations prepared to act together. Within hours of Washington's announcement, the mood in Ouagadougou turned from anxiety to determination. The president's refusal felt less like policy and more like emancipation. This rejection carried another irony. Trump expected Burkina Faso to seek backroom compromises, to plead for survival. Instead, Traoré treated the tariffs not as an economic challenge, but as proof of desperation in Washington. If the United States, with all its power, still needed to bully a landlocked nation of 22 million, then it was not Africa that was weak. It was the old order that was fragile. The symbolism grew heavier as events unfolded. In past decades, leaders faced with such pressure might have delayed, deferred, or softened their words. Traoré did none of these things. He rejected swiftly, unequivocally, as though the continent had rehearsed for this very moment. And perhaps it had. Across Africa, frustration had long simmered. Frustration with conditional aid, with exploitative contracts, with being treated as a supplier of raw materials and a consumer of pity. When the tariffs came, Traoré lit the match. Suddenly, Burkina Faso, often dismissed as peripheral, became the center of a storm. The announcement was replayed across African capitals, not as news but as vindication. For those weary of seeing leaders bow, it was the first breath of fresh air. For Washington, it was humiliation, raw and unexpected. The strength of Traoré's rejection lay not in economic might, but in moral clarity. He spoke as if he owed nothing to anyone but his people. And in that moment, millions across the continent felt the same. The old narrative that Africa must negotiate from weakness cracked open. What stood revealed was the possibility of standing firm, of choosing dignity over access, of saying no without collapse. This was the event that reset the conversation. Not a war, not a coup, not a protest. A refusal. A refusal that echoed louder than tanks because it punctured the very architecture of control. But what came next was not just defiance, it was an earthquake shaking both Africa and Washington alike. The rejection alone was thunder, but what followed was lightning. Within 72 hours of Donald Trump's tariff decree, the response across Africa transformed into something far greater than symbolic protest. It became action. Coordinated, deliberate, and shockingly effective. In Ouagadougou, crowds filled the streets. They did not march in silence. They sang, they danced, they waved flags as though independence had been declared again. What Traore had said in the palace halls was repeated in markets and villages. Africa will not kneel. For many, it felt like a release of breath held for decades. The catharsis of finally hearing a leader speak the words so long buried under compromises. Meanwhile, in Washington, the mood was very different. Reports leaked of late-night meetings in the White House, where advisors whispered of retaliation. Sanctions, diplomatic isolation, covert pressure, all were on the table. But behind the fury was disbelief. How could a landlocked state of 22 million defy the weight of America? For Donald Trump, who thrived on projecting dominance, the humiliation was personal. Being blocked by Burkina Faso was more than economic inconvenience. It was a dent in the image he had spent years cultivating. The tariffs themselves had been designed as a hammer, not a scalpel. They targeted the very lifeblood of Africa's exports: gold, textiles, cocoa, cotton, food staples. Washington believed the shock would send leaders scrambling. But instead of scattering, Africa closed ranks. By the third day, 34 nations had activated emergency trade agreements, absorbing 95% of the anticipated blow. What was meant to isolate instead united. It was as if the continent had been waiting for this test. And when it came, the rehearsal became reality. Shipments of gold that once would have crossed the Atlantic now shifted course towards Moscow. Agricultural goods earmarked for American markets found buyers in Asia. Textiles rerouted through intra-African trade networks bolstered by the African Continental Free Trade Area. The supposed chokehold dissolved into a web of alternatives. The speed shocked Washington. For decades, the assumption had been that African states, fragmented and dependent, had no escape routes. But the ground had shifted quietly over years. Multipolarity had given the continent options. Traore merely triggered the mechanism. And in doing so, he exposed how outdated the Western playbook had become. The emotional contrast could not have been sharper. In Burkina Faso, cheers rolled like a festival of dignity. In Washington, fury simmered, described by one insider as anger bordering on disbelief. For Trump's camp, the humiliation was unbearable, not because of material losses, but because of perception. A so-called small player had defied the superpower and survived. And in geopolitics, perception often matters more than raw numbers. Western media rushed to frame the story. Some called Traore reckless, a populist riding on emotion. Others, more cautious, admitted that Africa's response was unprecedented. African outlets, by contrast, hailed the moment as a turning point. Headlines spoke of Africa's trade emancipation, Burkina Faso's defiance, and the crumbling of fear. Social media across the continent flooded with images of Traore, portrayed not as a president alone, but as a symbol of resistance. The climax was not just political, but deeply human. For generations, Africans had watched their leaders fold under pressure, trading sovereignty for short-term relief. This time, they saw defiance without collapse. The sense of vindication was overwhelming. A young soldier turned president had stood where many expected compromise, and in doing so, gave voice to millions. Yet beneath the celebration lay a question that unsettled both friends and foes. Who exactly was this man who could look Washington in the eye and say no? But who is Ibrahim Traoré? And what in his story forged the audacity to defy an empire? The cheers in Ouagadougou did not fade quickly. They lingered like echoes across the dusty boulevards, carried in conversations at roadside stalls and whispered in villages where electricity is scarce, but hope now burned bright. For ordinary Burkinabé, the rejection of Trump's tariffs was more than foreign policy. It was proof that sovereignty was no longer an abstract promise. It was alive, embodied in the voice of their president. Inside the country, the consequences were immediate. Ibrahim Traoré's popularity, already strong, surged. He was not viewed merely as a head of state, but as a defender of dignity. The sight of young people painting his image on walls, chanting his words in rallies, revealed something larger than loyalty. It was belief. Belief that Burkina Faso, so often treated as peripheral, could set a precedent for the continent. This surge of confidence did not arise in a vacuum. Since seizing power in 2022, the event widely remembered as the Ibrahim Traoré coup, he had worked to redefine the nation's course. Foreign troops long stationed in Burkina Faso under the banner of counterterrorism were asked to leave. Mining concessions, once dominated by foreign companies, were pulled under state control. Agriculture, the backbone of survival, became a strategic priority as his government pushed for food self-sufficiency. These measures were not easy. They brought tension with Western capitals, loss of aid packages, and accusations of authoritarianism. But inside Burkina Faso, they built legitimacy. Each act of defiance reinforced the idea that leadership was finally rooted in local needs rather than foreign approval. The rejection of tariffs was not a sudden gesture. It was the natural continuation of a political philosophy: sovereignty first. For the region, the ripple effects were profound. Nigeria, with its oil wealth, watched closely. South Africa, a BRICS heavyweight, began recalculating its options. Kenya, long considered a logistics hub tied to Western markets, found itself reconsidering the balance between partnership and dependency. The symbolic weight of Burkina Faso's defiance made larger states ask uncomfortable questions. If a so-called small player could resist without collapse, what excuse remained for them? Within Burkina Faso, there was also a shift in psychology. For decades, poverty had been endured with the quiet resignation that the nation was too small to change its destiny. Now people spoke differently. Farmers discussed markets beyond the West. Traders imagined networks stretching into Asia and South America. The sense of confinement began to loosen. Sovereignty was no longer a word in speeches. It was felt in daily life. Yet this transformation carried risks. Washington was not prepared to accept humiliation quietly. Whispers of sanctions grew louder. International institutions, often guided by Western influence, signaled potential obstacles for loans and financial flows. Critics at home warned that defiance might lead to isolation. But Traoré's government pressed on, banking on the shield of multipolarity and the belief that the people's morale was itself a form of defense. The deeper consequence was emotional. Across Africa, the fear of punishment began to crack. Leaders in other capitals watched as Burkina Faso endured without collapse. Citizens elsewhere drew inspiration from images of defiance. What was once considered suicidal now appeared survivable. Fear, long the West's most reliable weapon, was losing its grip. For the international system, this was destabilizing. Western policymakers relied on the assumption that smaller states would never risk defying their directives. That assumption had just been shattered, and in its place rose a new uncertainty. If fear no longer ruled, what tool of control remained? The atmosphere inside Burkina Faso was a mixture of pride and vigilance. People celebrated, but they also braced for retaliation. Markets adjusted, entrepreneurs sought alternatives, and officials worked overtime to ensure the economy could withstand pressure. Every decision now carried symbolic weight. For the eyes of Africa, and indeed the world, Washington, were fixed on Ouagadougou. The domestic consequences of this defiance were clear. Confidence surged, legitimacy deepened, and a generation of Africans found proof that sovereignty was not a dream, but a choice. The political consequences, however, stretched far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. But could one nation's defiance truly endure without allies beyond Africa? Or would Washington find a way to tighten the noose once more? When Washington's tariffs fell flat against Ouagadougou, the world leaned closer. What looked like defiance from a small landlocked nation revealed something larger. Africa was no longer standing alone in the storm. The reason was not chance, but the shield of multipolarity that had quietly taken shape over the past decade. China was the first to respond. Its factories depend on African minerals. Cobalt from the Congo, manganese from South Africa, bauxite from Guinea. A tariff war that disrupted supply chains was unthinkable in Beijing. Within days, China expanded purchasing agreements and activated currency swaps, ensuring that African trade flows would not collapse. It was not charity. It was necessity. Russia followed with gold. For Moscow, bullion is more than metal. It is a bridge to bypass Western finance. Burkina Faso, newly assertive in controlling its mining sector, became a strategic supplier. Russian refiners stepped in with direct purchase deals and security guarantees. To Traore, this was not mere partnership. It was protection, proof that alternatives existed beyond Washington's reach. India's role was quieter but no less vital. With a population of more than 1.4 billion, its demand for food imports is relentless. African maize, pulses, and dairy found steady markets in Indian cities. At the same time, affordable Indian pharmaceuticals flowed into Africa, creating a mutually reinforcing loop of interdependence. When the United States tried to choke agriculture, India simply widened the door. Brazil, too, stepped into the breach. Bound by cultural memory and historical ties, Brasilia offered to strengthen bilateral trade channels. African cocoa and food staples found buyers in the Southern Hemisphere. It was not just symbolic solidarity. It was economic alignment across the global South. Even Europe, America's closest ally, hesitated. Brussels, wary of surrendering Africa entirely to Beijing and Moscow, absorbed some redirected exports. The European Union did not echo Traoré's fiery rhetoric, but its actions signaled a growing divergence from Washington's strategy. This convergence of partners formed the Shield. Not a single alliance, not a single deal, but a network of necessity. And it is within this network that the term Burkina Faso Revolution found meaning. Not as a violent upheaval, but as a diplomatic spark showing that sovereignty can be defended when the world is no longer unipolar. The implications are profound. If one nation can say no, protected by a web of global ties, then others may follow. Washington's fear is not the loss of Burkina Faso's trade, but the precedent, the risk that Nigeria, South Africa, or Kenya will ask why they too must obey. If the shield is real, what happens when an entire continent stands beneath it together? The dust of defiance did not settle. It rose, carried by winds beyond Ouagadougou, beyond West Africa, beyond the continent itself. What Ibrahim Traoré had ignited was not only a political standoff, but a question echoing across capitals. What comes next? For Africa, the possibilities are both exhilarating and perilous. On one hand, the rejection of tariffs demonstrated that dependency is not destiny. A continent long lectured to wait, to obey, to compromise discovered that alternatives exist. The African Continental Free Trade Area offers a foundation. Regional payment systems like PAPs reduce reliance on the dollar. Partnerships with Asia and Latin America diversify markets. A road once narrow now stretches wide, lined with choices. On the other hand, defiance carries risks. Washington does not forget humiliation easily. Sanctions could tighten, loans could be blocked, institutions influenced by Western power could close their doors. For a nation like Burkina Faso, already struggling with poverty and insurgency, the pressure will not disappear. Every step forward risks retaliation. Yet Traoré's strategy rests on a simple truth. The cost of obedience is greater than the cost of resistance. To submit would mean conceding sovereignty, returning to a cycle where resources flow out while dependency flows in. To resist is dangerous, but it keeps dignity intact. And dignity, once awakened, is harder to silence than any tariff. The continent now watches the dominoes. If Nigeria, with its oil wealth, demands contracts on its own terms, the energy map shifts. If South Africa leans harder on BRICS financial systems, the architecture of Western dominance cracks. If Kenya builds deeper ties with China and India without asking permission, the logistics routes of East Africa transform. Each step chips away at the idea that Washington's word is law. But the vision extends beyond Africa. In Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in the Caribbean, leaders observe carefully. The example of a so-called small player surviving defiance sends tremors through the hierarchy of global power. The message is not that Burkina Faso defeated the United States. It is that America's leverage is not absolute, and that sovereignty can be defended if nations are willing to pay the price. The road ahead is uncertain, but the symbolism is already secure. Africa is no longer framed only as a continent of victims, but as a stage where sovereignty is asserted. Traoré's defiance may be remembered as the opening note of a longer symphony, one where aid is replaced by trade, pity by partnership, silence by voice. But is this the spark of Africa's dawn, or only a passing flame waiting to be smothered by the old order? The dust of this confrontation may fade, but the mark it leaves on history will not. A landlocked nation of barely 22 million, long dismissed as marginal, has forced the world to rethink the architecture of power. By refusing tariffs, by saying no to humiliation, Burkina Faso turned a trade dispute into a declaration of emancipation. This is why the story is larger than economics. It is about a shift in perception, from weakness to strength, from dependence to sovereignty. The Ibrahim Traoré coup of 2022 was not simply a political rupture inside one country. It laid the groundwork for a leader who could later stand against Washington without trembling. It showed that dignity could be a governing principle rather than a rhetorical flourish. And now the refusal of Trump's tariffs has evolved into something deeper, a symbol of continental defiance. The so-called Burkina Faso revolution is not a call to arms, but a call to choices. Choices that larger nations, from Nigeria to South Africa, cannot ignore. Choices that ripple into Latin America and Southeast Asia, where others quietly ask, if a small African nation can resist, why not us? For the West, the nightmare is not the loss of trade, but the loss of fear. Tariffs and sanctions rely on obedience. Once obedience collapses, the instruments of control turn hollow. That collapse began the moment Ibrahim Traoré said no and survived. The world now waits to see whether this spark becomes a flame. Will Africa unite under the shield of multipolarity, or will Washington find new levers to pull? No one can answer with certainty. But one truth is undeniable. The balance of power is shifting, and the voice of Africa is no longer silent. If this resonates with your sense of justice, do not turn away. Subscribe, share, and stand with this story, because history is not written by the strongest, but by those who refuse to kneel. In the end, the lesson of the Ibrahim Traoré coup is simple yet seismic. Sovereignty is not granted, it is taken. And once taken, it can inspire a continent,